The women who had served as auxiliaries, nurses, and radio operators for the Wehrmacht expected nothing but brutality once they fell into Allied hands. For years, they had heard whispered warnings in barracks and field hospitals about what happened to women captured by enemy forces. The stories were dark, filled with violence, humiliation, and degradation that made even hardened soldiers fall silent. These women had been told that surrender meant a fate worse than death, that the Americans and British were barbaric in their treatment of female prisoners, and that no mercy would be shown to those who had worn the German uniform. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As the war ground toward its bitter conclusion in the spring of 1945, thousands of German women found themselves caught in the chaos of collapsing front lines. Some had been stationed at communication posts deep in occupied France. Others had worked as medical staff in field hospitals across Italy. Still more had served in administrative roles throughout the crumbling Reich. When Allied forces swept through their positions, these women faced a terrible choice: flee into an uncertain landscape of destruction, or surrender to an enemy they had been taught to fear above all else. Margarete Fischer, a 23-year-old radio operator from Bavaria, remembered the moment her unit received orders to evacuate their position near the Rhine. The Americans were advancing faster than anyone had predicted. Officers who days before had spoken confidently of holding the line now burned documents and prepared for retreat. The women gathered what few possessions they could carry. Margarete clutched a small photograph of her family, wondering if she would ever see them again. Around her, other women whispered prayers or stood in stunned silence, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. When the order to surrender finally came, it felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. The women lined up in the courtyard of their headquarters, hands raised as American soldiers approached with weapons drawn. Margarete's heart hammered in her chest. She had spent sleepless nights imagining this moment, picturing the violence she had been warned about. The propaganda films shown in training had depicted Allied soldiers as savage, undisciplined brutes who showed no respect for the conventions of war. She braced herself for shouting, for rough hands, for the beginning of a nightmare she might not survive. Instead, the first American soldier who approached her was a young man with freckles and tired eyes. He looked barely older than her younger brother. He gestured for her to lower her hands and spoke words she did not understand, but his tone was not harsh. Another soldier, older and wearing sergeant stripes, walked down the line of women with a clipboard making notes. No one grabbed them. No one struck them. The absence of violence was so jarring that Margarete felt dizzy, as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. The women were searched by female American military personnel, members of the Women's Army Corps, who conducted the process with brisk efficiency but no cruelty. Personal items were confiscated and catalogued. Watches, jewelry, letters from home, all were placed in bags to be returned later. The women were then loaded onto trucks for transport to a temporary holding facility. As they climbed aboard, Margarete caught the eye of her friend, Helga, a nurse who had spent 2 years in field hospitals. Helga's expression mirrored her own confusion. This was not what they had expected. This was not what they had been told would happen. The journey to the temporary holding facility took several hours. Through the canvas flaps of the truck, the women glimpsed a landscape transformed by war. Villages stood empty, their windows dark. Fields that should have been green with spring growth lay churned and muddy by tank treads. Allied convoys passed them going in the opposite direction, long columns of vehicles stretching to the horizon. The sheer scale of the American military presence was overwhelming. Trucks, jeeps, tanks, artillery pieces, all moving with mechanical precision. For women who had watched German supplies dwindle month by month, the abundance was shocking. They arrived at a camp that had been hastily constructed in the grounds of what had once been a wealthy estate. The main house still stood, though pockmarked with bullet holes. Around it, rows of canvas tents had been erected, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. American soldiers directed the trucks to a processing area where the women disembarked, stiff and sore from the journey. They stood in uncertain clusters, eyeing the guards and the wire with barely concealed dread. Processing took hours. Each woman was interviewed through interpreters, their names and service records documented. Medical personnel examined them for wounds and illnesses. The women had expected harsh interrogations, but the questions were perfunctory, almost bureaucratic. Where had they served? What had been their duties? Did they have family members in the German military? The American officers seemed more interested in filling out forms than in extracting intelligence or administering punishment. When the interviews concluded, the women were led to their assigned tents. Each tent housed 12 women on simple cots with thin mattresses and wool blankets. It was Spartan, but it was clean. The canvas was new, not rotting or torn. The cots were sturdy. After months of sleeping in bombed-out buildings or overcrowded barracks, even this basic shelter felt almost luxurious. Margarete claimed a cot near the entrance and sat down carefully, testing its strength. It held without creaking. She allowed herself a tiny exhalation of relief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first meal arrived as evening fell. American soldiers carried large pots into a central mess area and served the women from a line. Marguerite accepted a metal tray and watched as beans, bread, and some kind of meat stew were ladled onto it. The portions were generous, far more than she had seen in German rations for over a year. She carried her tray to a bench and sat down, staring at the food. Around her, other women did the same, their expressions ranging from suspicion to barely controlled hunger. Helga sat beside her, holding her own tray. "Do you think it's safe?" she whispered in German. "What if they've poisoned it?" Marguerite shook her head slowly. "Why go to the trouble of documenting us, giving us beds, and then poisoning us? It makes no sense." "Nothing makes sense anymore," Helga replied, but she picked up her spoon. The first bite was a revelation. The stew was hot, properly seasoned, and contained actual chunks of meat. The bread was white, soft and fresh. Marguerite had not tasted white bread in 2 years. In Germany, even officers received only the coarse black bread made from sawdust and whatever grain could be scraped together. This bread tasted like peacetime, like the bakery near her childhood home. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about her family back home who were likely surviving on far less. Around the mess area, the scene repeated itself dozens of times. Women who had braced themselves for starvation rations found themselves confronted with abundance. Some ate ravenously, years of hunger overcoming caution. Others wept quietly as they ate, overwhelmed by the simple dignity of a proper meal. A few still refused to touch their food, convinced it was a trick, but hunger would overcome their resistance within a day or two. After the meal, the women were allowed to return to their tents. No one locked them in, no one posted guards at the tent flaps. The only restriction was the perimeter fence, and even that seemed more about keeping order than inflicting punishment. Marguerite lay on her cot that first night, staring up at the canvas ceiling, listening to the quiet sounds of other women settling in. Some whispered to each other, others cried softly, many simply lay in exhausted silence. Her mind churned with questions. Why were the Americans treating them this way? What was the purpose of such relative kindness? She had been prepared for brutality, for degradation, for treatment that would confirm everything she had been told about the enemy. Instead, she had been given food, shelter, and a medical examination. The cognitive dissonance was painful, like trying to hold two opposite truths in her mind at once. The days that followed established a routine that further undermined the women's expectations. Morning roll call was conducted efficiently, but without the screaming and abuse they had known in German military service.
Breakfast was served at 7, another substantial meal of porridge, bread, and sometimes eggs or tinned fruit. The women were assigned light work duties, helping to maintain the camp, assisting in the kitchen, or sorting supplies. The work was not grueling. No one was driven to exhaustion or punished for working too slowly. Medical care proved to be another shock. The camp had a fully staffed medical tent run by American Army nurses and doctors. Women with chronic conditions, injuries, or illnesses were treated without hesitation. Helga, who had developed a persistent cough during her service, was examined by a doctor who prescribed medication and ordered her to rest. The medicine worked. Within a week, her cough had subsided. She stared at the empty bottle in wonder, remembering how German military doctors had waved off her complaints, telling her to endure and continue working. Personal hygiene facilities, while basic, were maintained to a standard that surprised everyone. There were showers with actual hot water available on a schedule. Soap was provided, real soap that lathered and cleaned, not the harsh ersatz substance they had used in Germany. The women were given clean uniforms, simple gray dresses that marked them as prisoners, but were well made and comfortable. After years of wearing the same threadbare clothes, washing them in cold water and hanging them to dry while still damp, the luxury of clean clothing felt almost decadent. The American guards were another source of confusion. They were young men, most of them farm boys and city workers drafted into service. They carried rifles and maintained watch from the towers, but their interactions with the prisoners were oddly casual. Some learned basic German phrases and would greet the women with Guten Morgen during roll call. Others shared cigarettes through the fence or showed photographs of their own families back home. This familiarity was deeply unsettling to women who had been taught that military discipline required harsh distance between captor and captive. Margarete found herself in conversation with one guard, a tall soldier from Wisconsin who spoke a little German learned from his grandparents. His name was Private Miller, and he seemed genuinely curious about life in Germany before the war. They spoke in halting, mixed German and English, gesturing when words failed. He told her about his family's dairy farm, about milking cows before dawn and the smell of hay in the summer. She told him about her father's bookshop in Munich, about the narrow streets and the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings.
"Why are you being kind to us?" she asked him one afternoon, the question that had haunted her since arrival. Private Miller looked uncomfortable. He shifted his rifle to his other shoulder and thought for a moment. "Orders," he said finally. "Geneva Convention. But also," he struggled for words, "you're people. You're not soldiers anymore. You're just people, trying to get home." The simplicity of his answer struck her. Just people. Not enemies. Not threats. Just people caught in the machinery of a war none of them had chosen. The idea was radical, almost dangerous. It challenged the clear divisions she had been taught to maintain between us and them, between German and American, between victor and vanquished. Letters from home began to arrive, filtered through the Red Cross. The first time Margarete held an envelope addressed in her mother's handwriting, she broke down weeping. The letter was months old, written before her capture, full of mundane details about neighbors and rationing and the struggle to keep warm through the winter. Her mother wrote about planting vegetables in the garden, about mending clothes that were already more patched than original fabric, about hoping the war would end soon. There was no mention of politics, no fervent declarations of loyalty to the Reich, just a mother's words to her daughter, filled with love and worry. Many women received no letters. Their homes had been in cities that no longer existed, reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. They sat quietly while others read their mail, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes betrayed their grief. The Americans made no attempt to censor the women's reactions or to use their pain for propaganda purposes. They simply allowed the women to mourn, to hope, to maintain whatever connection they could to the lives they had left behind. Recreational time was another unexpected grace. In the evenings, after work duties had concluded and dinner had been served, the women were allowed to gather in groups. Some sang German folk songs, their voices rising in harmony under the spring sky. Others organized classes, teaching each other English or mathematics, or sharing skills they had learned before the war. A former teacher held lessons in literature. A seamstress showed others how to mend and alter their clothing. These small acts of normalcy, of cultural continuity, were not forbidden or mocked. The American guards sometimes stopped to listen to the singing, their faces thoughtful. The spring weather grew warmer. The estate grounds, once manicured and formal, had gone somewhat wild during the war years. Wildflowers bloomed in the untended gardens. Trees that had survived the fighting began to bud and leaf. The women could see all of this through the fence, a reminder of the world beyond their captivity. Some spent their free time walking the perimeter, as close to the natural world as they could get, breathing air that smelled of grass and earth rather than canvas and disinfectant. It was during one of these warm afternoons that everything changed again. The women were gathered in the central area of the camp, some sitting on benches that had been constructed from scrap lumber, others standing in small groups talking. The sun was bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made captivity feel especially cruel. Margarete stood with Helga and two other women, discussing rumors they had heard about the war's end. Someone had overheard guards saying that Berlin had fallen. Someone else claimed that Hitler was dead. The rumors were contradictory and impossible to verify, but they spoke them anyway, hungry for any information. An American officer approached their group. He was a captain, older than most of the soldiers, with gray at his temples and a weathered face that suggested he had seen considerable action. The women fell silent as he approached, instinctively straightening to attention. Old habits died hard. The captain spoke in clear, slow English, and a translator, a German-American soldier, rendered his words into German. "Ladies," he began, and the formality of the address was jarring. They were not used to being called ladies. "The weather is getting warm, and we recognize that conditions in the camp can be uncomfortable. We have received permission to offer you an opportunity for some relief." The women exchanged uncertain glances. What kind of opportunity? What was the cost? The captain continued. "There is a river on the estate grounds, beyond the main fence. It's clean and safe for swimming. We will be organizing supervised recreation periods where groups of you will be allowed to use the river. You'll be escorted by female personnel and guards, but you will have the opportunity to swim, to cool off, and to enjoy some time outside the camp." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The translator repeated the words as if the women had not understood. Swimming. In a river. Outside the camp. The concepts seemed to belong to a different world, a world of peacetime summers and childhood memories, not to a prisoner of war camp in the aftermath of the greatest conflict in human history. Helga was the first to find her voice. "Swimming," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "You want to let us swim? In the river?" The captain nodded. "Yes, we understand this has been a difficult time. We believe that maintaining morale and health requires more than just adequate food and shelter. You've been cooperative, and we see no reason to deny you this opportunity." Margarete felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet again. She had adjusted to the food, to the clean clothes, to the relative comfort of the camp. She had even grown accustomed to the casual kindness of some guards. But this was beyond comprehension. Swimming implied leisure, implied pleasure, implied a recognition of their humanity that went far beyond the basic requirements of the Geneva Convention.
"When?" someone asked from the back of the group. "Tomorrow afternoon," the captain replied, "weather permitting. We'll organize groups of 30 at a time. The river is large enough to accommodate everyone over the course of several days. Participation is voluntary, of course. No one will be forced to go." Voluntary. That word hung in the air. When had anything been voluntary in their lives over the past years? Orders had been absolute. Duty had been non-negotiable. Choice had been an illusion. And now an American officer stood before them offering a choice, offering something that served no strategic purpose, something that existed purely for their benefit. As the captain walked away, the women erupted into excited, confused conversation. Some were immediately eager, already imagining the feel of cool water on their skin. Others remained suspicious, convinced this was some elaborate trap or humiliation. A few were scandalized at the very idea of swimming in front of male guards, even if female personnel would be present. The debate continued through dinner and into the evening, voices rising and falling in the tents long after lights out. Margarete lay awake that night, wrestling with her own thoughts. Part of her wanted desperately to believe that the offer was genuine, that tomorrow she might wade into a river and feel, for a few moments, something approaching freedom. Another part of her, the part shaped by years of propaganda and military discipline, insisted that this had to be a trick. No army treated its prisoners this way. No captor offered such kindness without expecting something in return. But what could they possibly want? The women had already been interrogated. Their military value was negligible. They possessed no important intelligence, commanded no resources, controlled no strategic positions. They were, as Private Miller had said, just people trying to get home. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the Americans simply saw them as human beings deserving of basic dignity and occasional joy, even in captivity. The thought was revolutionary. It challenged everything she had been taught about power, about war, about the nature of enemy and ally. If the Americans could afford to be kind, to be generous, to think of their prisoners' happiness, what did that say about the system she had served? What did it say about the ideology that had promised strength through cruelty and unity through hatred? These questions followed her into troubled sleep, and when morning came with its familiar roll call and breakfast routine, they still churned in her mind. Today would bring answers. Today she would discover whether the promise of the river was real, or whether it was, as some still insisted, merely another form of psychological warfare designed to break their spirits through false hope. The women who had volunteered for the first group gathered after lunch, 30 of them, including Margarete and Helga. They were given simple swimming costumes, practical one-piece suits that the American military had somehow procured. The very existence of these garments suggested that the swimming plan had been thought through, that this was not a spontaneous decision, but a deliberate policy. They changed in their tents, helping each other with unfamiliar fastenings, their voices a mix of excitement and nervous laughter. Female American personnel, women from the Women's Army Corps, arrived to escort them. These women wore military uniforms but smiled and chatted as they organized the group. One of them, a sergeant with red hair and freckles, spoke passable German. "The river is beautiful. You're gonna love it. It's been too long since any of us had a proper swim too." The implication that the American women would be swimming alongside them, that this was a shared activity rather than a supervised punishment, struck Margarete as significant. They would not be alone in the water, watched like animals in a zoo. They would be swimming with their captors, as if the barrier between prisoner and guard could be temporarily dissolved by the simple act of entering a river together. The walk to the river took 20 minutes, following a path through overgrown gardens and past a small orchard where apple trees were just beginning to flower. Male guards accompanied them, but kept a respectful distance. The women walked in a loose group, some linking arms, others walking alone, all of them acutely aware that they were outside the fence for the first time since their capture. The sunshine felt different out here, warmer somehow, and the air smelled of wild roses and fresh grass. Then they saw it. The river wound through the estate grounds, perhaps 30 meters wide at this point, its water clear enough to see the rocky bottom in the shallows. Trees overhung the banks, their branches creating dappled shade. The current was gentle, barely more than a drift. It looked like something from a painting, from a memory of childhood summers before the world had caught fire. For a moment, the women simply stood and stared. The beauty of it, the ordinary, peaceful beauty, was almost painful after years of ugliness and violence. Some began to cry quietly, overwhelmed by the sight of something so normal, so untouched by war. Others smiled, genuine smiles that transformed their tired faces into something younger, something hopeful. "The water is cold but not freezing," the red-haired surgeon told them. "Stay in the shallow areas unless you're a strong swimmer. We have lifeguards positioned downstream just in case. Take your time. Enjoy yourselves." Enjoy yourselves. These words were an incantation, a spell that broke the final barrier of disbelief. This was real. This was happening. They were going to swim in a river, and no one was going to hurt them, humiliate them, or use this moment against them. They were simply going to swim.
Helga was the first to wade in, gasping as the cold water rose to her knees, then laughing, actually laughing, a sound of pure delight. Others followed, some cautious, some bold, moving into the current with varying degrees of confidence. Margarete stood on the bank for a moment longer, watching her fellow prisoners transform into something else. Not soldiers, not prisoners, just women, playing in a river on a beautiful spring afternoon. She stepped into the water. The cold was shocking and wonderful. It rose around her ankles, her calves, her thighs, each step taking her deeper. When the water reached her waist, she pushed off from the bottom and began to swim, her body remembering skills learned in childhood at a lake near Munich. The current carried her gently downstream, and she floated on her back, staring up at the blue sky through the canopy of trees, feeling the sun on her face and the water supporting her weight. For the first time in years, Margarete Fischer felt something that might have been peace. The water became a mirror that reflected not just the sky above, but a truth the women had been avoiding since their capture. As Margarete floated in the gentle current, eyes closed against the spring sun, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This was not strategy. This was not calculated psychological warfare. This was simply kindness, offered without expectation of return, extended to women who had worn the uniform of an enemy regime. The realization was almost more shocking than the swimming itself. Around her, the river came alive with the sounds of women rediscovering joy. Helga splashed like a child, sending arcs of water glittering through the afternoon light. Two nurses who had served together in an Italian field hospital floated side by side, holding hands, their faces tilted toward the sun with expressions of such peace that they looked like Renaissance paintings of saints. Others dove beneath the surface and emerged gasping and laughing, their hair plastered to their heads, their skin pink from the cold. The American WWII personnel swam among them, not as guards, but as companions, showing the less confident swimmers how to float, pointing out the best spots where the current was gentlest. The red-haired sergeant, whose name they learned was Dorothy, treaded water near Margarete and grinned. "Not so bad, is it?" she said in her accented German. "I don't understand," Margarete replied, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Why are you doing this? Why are you being so kind to us?" Dorothy's expression grew more serious. She swam a few strokes closer, lowering her voice so only Margarete could hear. "Because you're people. Because this war has taken enough from everyone. Because maybe if we remember how to be human to each other, we can stop this from happening again." She paused, then added, "And because our commanders believe that treating prisoners with dignity isn't weakness, it's strength. It's showing what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against." The words settled into Margarete's chest like stones, heavy and undeniable. What had the Reich been fighting for? Lebensraum, racial purity, the dominance of one people over all others. And what had America been fighting for? She looked around at the scene in the river, at the mixing of former enemies and the simple shared activity of swimming, and thought perhaps she was beginning to understand. They had been fighting for this, for the possibility of dignity, for the idea that all people deserved basic humanity regardless of which uniform they had worn. The first swimming session lasted 2 hours. When Dorothy finally called them back to shore, the women emerged reluctantly, their skin wrinkled from the water, their bodies tired in a good way that had nothing to do with forced labor or military drills. They had been allowed to simply exist, to take pleasure in something as ordinary and wonderful as cold water on a hot day. As they dried themselves with towels the Americans provided, soft cotton towels that smelled of soap, the women spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones. I had forgotten. I had forgotten what it felt like to do something just for the joy of it. Everything has been duty, obligation, survival for so long. I had forgotten about joy. Others nodded, understanding completely. The war had stripped so much from them layer by layer until they had become creatures of pure function, existing only to serve whatever purpose their superiors demanded. The river had given them back a piece of themselves they thought lost forever. Not their identities as soldiers or Germans or prisoners, but their identities as human beings capable of pleasure and wonder. Walking back to camp, the women were quieter than they had been on the journey out. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear or suspicion, but the contemplative stillness of people processing something profound. Margarete walked beside Helga, both of them barefoot on the warm path, their hair still damp and smelling of river water. Helga reached out and squeezed Margarete's hand briefly, and no words were needed. They had shared something that transcended language, a moment of grace in the midst of captivity. That evening, the entire camp buzzed with conversation about the swimming. Those who had gone described every detail to those who had not, their voices animated, their hands gesturing to illustrate the size of the river, the temperature of the water, the feeling of floating free. Women who had been skeptical or afraid now signed up eagerly for the next sessions. Even the most hardened, those who had clung most tightly to their distrust of American intentions, found their resolve weakening. How could you maintain hatred for people who gave you such gifts?
The swimming sessions continued over the following weeks, each group of women taking their turn at the river. The routine became something everyone looked forward to, a bright spot in the otherwise monotonous rhythm of camp life. But more than just recreation, the river became a place of transformation. In the water, stripped of uniforms and ranks and the trappings of military identity, the women discovered they could talk to each other in new ways. Conversations that would have been impossible in the rigid hierarchy of German military service flowed as easily as the current. A former officer found herself swimming beside a woman who had been a typist, and they discussed literature and philosophy as equals. A nurse who had grown up on a farm in Prussia traded stories with a radio operator from Berlin. Their different backgrounds no longer barriers, but sources of mutual fascination. The American women joined these conversations, sharing their own stories of life before the war, of families and dreams, and the ordinary hopes that all people carried, regardless of nationality. Margarete found herself in deeper and deeper conversations with Dorothy during the swimming sessions. The sergeant had studied history at a university in Massachusetts before the war, and she spoke about the Treaty of Versailles, about the economic conditions that had allowed extremism to flourish in Germany, about the complex web of causes that had led to this global conflict. She did not lecture or condemn. She simply discussed, treating Margarete as an intellectual equal, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. "What will you do after?" Dorothy asked one afternoon as they floated in a quiet eddy away from the main group. "When the war is over and you can go home?" Margarete had been avoiding this question, but in the peaceful embrace of the water, she found herself answering honestly. "I don't know if there's a home to go back to. Munich has been bombed so heavily. My father's bookshop is probably rubble. My family, if they survived, will be living in conditions I can barely imagine. And She paused, struggling to articulate the thought. "I don't know if I can go back to being the person I was before. Everything I believed has been challenged. Everything I was taught seems suspect now. Dorothy nodded slowly. That's not a bad thing, questioning everything. That's how we grow, how we become better than we were. The hard part is figuring out what to build with the pieces that are left. How do you rebuild a country? Margarete asked, and she was no longer talking just about Germany. She was talking about herself, about the internal landscape that had been bombed as thoroughly as any city. Carefully, Dorothy replied, with humility, with a willingness to learn from mistakes, and with grace for yourself and others, because everyone is going to be struggling with the same questions you are. These conversations continued week after week, not just between Margarete and Dorothy, but throughout the camp. The river became a place where ideas flowed as freely as water, where women who had been enemies discovered they shared more in common than they had ever imagined. They talked about their families, their hopes, their fears. They discussed what they had been told about Americans and how starkly that propaganda contrasted with the reality they were living. They debated what the future might hold, for Germany, for Europe, for themselves. The psychological impact was profound. Women who had arrived at the camp still clinging to Nazi ideology found those beliefs eroding like riverbanks in flood season. How could you maintain that Americans were subhuman barbarians when they treated you with such consistent dignity? How could you believe in the superiority of German culture when American culture had produced not just weapons but also the generous spirit that allowed enemy prisoners to swim in rivers? The cognitive dissonance became unbearable, and slowly, painfully, old certainties began to crumble. Not everyone changed at the same pace. Some women remained resistant, insisting that the kindness was a trick, that the true cruelty would reveal itself eventually. A few even refused to participate in the swimming, viewing it as a betrayal of German values to accept such gifts from the enemy. But they were increasingly isolated in their stance. The majority of women in the camp were undergoing a transformation that went much deeper than gratitude for good treatment. They were beginning to question everything they had been taught about the world. Letters home, carefully written to pass censorship, began to reflect this shift. Women wrote to their families about being treated well, about having enough to eat, about being allowed to swim in a river. They could not write explicitly about their changing worldviews, but the subtext was clear. One woman wrote to her sister, "The people here are not what we were told. They are ordinary people with families and hopes, just like us. I think many lies were told on both sides, and I am beginning to understand how we all ended up in this terrible situation." Another woman, writing to her mother, said, "When this is over and I come home, I will have so much to tell you that cannot be written in letters. I have learned things about the world and about myself that have changed me forever. I hope you will understand. I hope Germany will find a way to learn these lessons too."
The American command began to notice the transformation. Reports went up the chain describing the remarkable shift in prisoner morale and attitude. What had begun as a simple humanitarian gesture, allowing women to swim in good weather, had become something more significant. It had become a demonstration of American values in action, more effective than any propaganda film or interrogation technique. The prisoners were not being broken down, they were being built back up, but in a different image than the one that had been imposed on them by the Nazi regime. Senior officers visited the camp to observe this phenomenon. They watched the women swimming, laughing, interacting freely with American personnel. They read reports of conversations overheard, of the questions prisoners were asking, of the doubts they were expressing about their former beliefs. One general, observing a swimming session from a distance, remarked to his aide, "This is how you win a peace, not just a war. You show people a better way to live, and you let them choose it for themselves." The summer advanced, and with it came news that the war in the Pacific was also drawing to a close. The women in the camp learned of Germany's unconditional surrender, of the division of their country into occupation zones, and of the terrible revelations emerging from concentration camps that many had not even known existed. Each piece of news was a hammer blow to whatever remained of their old worldview. Some women refused to believe the reports of atrocities. Others wept with shame and horror. All of them struggled to reconcile the nation they thought they had served with the reality that was being uncovered. The river became a place of grief as much as joy. Women floated in the water and cried for everything that had been lost, for the lies they had believed, for the suffering they had unknowingly supported. The American women did not offer platitudes or easy absolution. They simply bore witness, swimming beside the German women, offering silent companionship in grief. Dorothy told Margarete during one such session, "You can't change the past. You can only decide what you're going to do with the knowledge you have now. That's the burden and the gift of survival." As summer turned toward autumn, preparations began for repatriation. The women would be sent back to Germany, to a country they no longer recognized and that would likely not recognize them. The thought filled many with dread. What would they find there? How would they survive in the ruins? And more troubling still, how would they explain to those who had not been captured what they had learned, what they had experienced, what they now believed? The final swimming session before repatriation was bittersweet. The river had become a symbol of everything their captivity had meant: the unexpected kindness, the transformation of belief, the discovery of shared humanity across the lines of war. As Margarete floated in the water one last time, she tried to memorize every sensation: the cold embrace of the current, the dappled sunlight through the trees, the sounds of women laughing and talking in mixed German and English. She knew that when she returned to Germany, people would not believe her stories. They would think she had been brainwashed or had gone mad. How could she explain that swimming in an American river had taught her more about humanity than all her years of Nazi education? Dorothy swam up beside her one last time. "You're going to be okay," she said softly. "It won't be easy, but you're strong enough to carry what you've learned here and use it to build something better." "I hope so," Margarete replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope we all are." The last evening in camp, the women gathered in the central area for a final meal. The Americans had prepared something special, not the usual camp fare, but a feast of sorts, with chicken and vegetables and even a cake someone had managed to bake. It was not lavish by peacetime standards, but after years of deprivation, it felt like a banquet. As the women ate, they sang songs, both German and American, their voices blending in harmonies that would have been unthinkable months before. When it came time to board the trucks that would take them to the trains, to the ships, to the long journey home, many women wept openly. They hugged their American guards, thanked them in halting English, pressed small handmade gifts into their hands. Margarete found Dorothy in the crowd and embraced her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for the river, for the conversations, for showing me that the world can be different than I thought." Dorothy hugged her back fiercely. "Take that knowledge home with you. Germany is going to need people who understand that there's another way. Promise me you'll remember." "I promise," Margarete said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The trucks rolled away from the camp, and the women looked back until the tents and fences disappeared from view. They were returning to a broken country, to uncertainty and hardship and the enormous task of rebuilding not just buildings but souls. But they carried with them something precious and unexpected: the memory of a river,
of kindness given without conditions, of the moment they discovered that even in the darkest times, humanity could survive and flourish.
The journey home was long and difficult. The Germany they returned to bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were homeless, displaced, wandering in search of lost family members. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer still. The occupation forces divided the country into zones, each with its own character and challenges. In the Soviet zone, former Nazi Party members faced harsh retribution. In the Western zones, the Americans, British, and French implemented denazification programs that were often inconsistent but generally less brutal. Margarete made her way back to Munich, or what remained of it. The city of her childhood was a landscape of ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been erased by Allied bombing. Her father's bookshop was gone, the building reduced to a pile of bricks and charred timber. But her family had survived. They were living in a basement, sharing space with 3 other families, surviving on rations and whatever they could trade or scavenge. The reunion was tearful and complicated. Her mother held her and wept, grateful beyond words that her daughter had survived. Her younger brother, now a thin teenager who looked far older than his years, stared at her as if she were a ghost. In the weeks that followed, Margarete tried to explain where she had been, what she had experienced. Her family listened with expressions ranging from disbelief to confusion to something that might have been anger. They had suffered so much during the final year of the war, enduring bombing raids, starvation rations, the collapse of everything they had known. And she had been in America, eating white bread and swimming in a river? "You don't understand," Margarete tried to explain one evening as they huddled around a small fire for warmth. "It changed everything I thought I knew. The Americans weren't what we were told. They treated us like human beings. They showed us that another way was possible." Her mother, exhausted and aged beyond her years, shook her head slowly. "I'm glad you were treated well. Truly, I am. But it's hard to hear about kindness when we've lived through such cruelty here. We needed you, and you were gone. That's all I can think about right now." The gap between her experience and theirs felt unbridgeable. But Margarete persisted. She found other women who had been in American camps, and they formed an informal network, meeting to share their stories and support each other. They discovered they were not alone in struggling to reconcile their captivity experience with the reality of post-war Germany. Together, they talked about the river, about the conversations, about the slow transformation of understanding. And together, they tried to figure out how to use what they had learned. Some of these women became teachers, determined to educate the next generation differently than they had been educated. Others worked in reconstruction efforts, bringing to the task an openness to American methods and democratic ideals that surprised their neighbors. Margarete found work as a translator, her improved English and understanding of American culture making her valuable in the occupation administration. It was difficult work, navigating between 2 worlds, often mistrusted by both sides. Germans saw her as too sympathetic to the occupiers. Americans sometimes viewed her with suspicion because of her past service. But she persisted, believing that bridge building, however uncomfortable, was essential. The story of the swimming sessions became one she told often, whenever she was asked to explain why she believed in reconciliation rather than resentment. "They could have treated us terribly," she would say. "They would have been justified. We had served the regime that started this war, that caused so much suffering. But instead, they gave us dignity. They let us swim in a river on summer afternoons. That choice, that small act of kindness, changed me more than any punishment could have. It showed me that people can choose to break cycles of cruelty, that we don't have to replicate the violence done to us. Not everyone understood. Many Germans in the immediate post-war years were too focused on survival, on rebuilding, on dealing with their own trauma, to think about such abstract concepts. Some accused her and women like her of being naive, of having been brainwashed by American propaganda. But slowly, over years and then decades, attitudes shifted. The Marshall Plan brought American aid that rebuilt infrastructure and industry. Democratic institutions took root in West Germany. A new generation grew up without the poisonous ideology of the Nazi years. And through it all, women like Margarete told their stories. They spoke at schools and community centers. They wrote memoirs. They gave interviews to historians. The tale of German female prisoners of war being allowed to swim in American rivers became part of the complex tapestry of post-war memory, a counterpoint to the darker stories of suffering and atrocity. It was not meant to excuse or erase those darker truths. Rather, it existed alongside them, a reminder that even in wartime, even between enemies, moments of grace were possible. Dorothy, the red-haired sergeant, returned to Massachusetts after the war and became a teacher. She and Margarete exchanged letters for many years, maintaining the friendship that had begun in such unlikely circumstances. Dorothy married, had children, and often told her students about her time guarding German prisoners of war, about the women she had met and the conversations they had shared. War brings out the worst in humanity, but it can also reveal the best. The question is which we choose to nurture, which we allow to define us going forward.
In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, a reunion was organized. Former German prisoners of war and their American guards met in New York City, a carefully planned event that drew media attention. Margarete attended, along with Helga and several other women who had been at the camp. Dorothy was there too, her red hair now streaked with gray, her smile as warm as ever. They embraced like the old friends they were, tears streaming down their faces, years of separation dissolved in an instant. A reporter asked Margarete what it felt like to see Dorothy again. She thought for a long moment before answering, "It feels like coming home to a part of myself I thought I had lost." This woman, who I met as my captor, became one of the most important people in my life. She and others like her showed me that the world didn't have to be the way I had been taught it was. That lesson has guided every decision I've made in the past 20 years. That lesson helped me become someone I could respect. The reunion made news in both countries. Photos appeared in newspapers showing former enemies embracing, laughing, sharing meals. The image of Margarete and Dorothy, arms around each other's shoulders, became iconic. It was used in textbooks, in documentaries, in discussions about reconciliation and the long path from war to peace. But for those who had lived it, the reunion was less about symbolism and more about genuine affection, about friendships forged in unlikely places that had withstood the test of time and distance. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and redefined itself, stories like Margarete's became part of the national conversation about memory and responsibility. How should Germans remember the war? What lessons should be taught to future generations? There were many difficult, painful stories that needed to be told and remembered. But there were also stories like the river, stories that showed that even in the darkest times, individual humans could choose kindness, could choose to see the humanity in their enemies, could plant seeds that would grow into something better. Margarete lived into her 80s,
long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, to witness the reunification of Germany, to watch her grandchildren grow up in a country that bore little resemblance to the one she had known in her youth. In her final years, when young people would ask her about the war, about what she had learned, she always came back to the river. "I learned," she would say, her voice still strong despite her age, "that the real battle is not between nations or ideologies, but between the part of humanity that seeks to dominate and destroy and the part that seeks to understand and uplift. I saw both during the war. I participated in the first, to my eternal shame, but I also experienced the second, unexpectedly, as a prisoner. American soldiers let us swim in a river, and in doing so, they taught me that another world was possible. That lesson has been the foundation of everything good I've tried to do since." She passed away in 2003, surrounded by family. Her life a testament to the possibility of transformation and growth even after terrible mistakes. Her obituary mentioned her wartime service, but it focused more on her decades of work promoting reconciliation, teaching tolerance, and advocating for the democratic values she had first glimpsed as a prisoner of war in an American camp in 1945. Dorothy lived until 2010, and when she died, her family found boxes of letters from Margarete and other German women she had known during the war. They donated them to a museum dedicated to preserving stories of the post-war period. Researchers who studied the correspondence were struck by the depth of the friendships, the intellectual rigor of the discussions, the genuine affection that flowed across the divide of former enemies. One letter, written by Margarete in 1967, summed up what the experience had meant. "When I think back to that summer, to those afternoons in the river, I realize now that you gave us more than recreation. You gave us back ourselves. You treated us not as enemies to be punished or tools to be used, but as human beings deserving of dignity and joy. In a world that had forgotten such things were possible, you remembered. You chose grace over cruelty, and that choice rippled outward in ways you may never fully know. Every good thing I've done since then, every moment I've chosen understanding over hatred, compassion over vengeance, began in that river. Thank you for that gift. Thank you for showing me another way." The legacy of those swimming sessions extends beyond individual stories. In the complex process of post-war reconciliation, small acts of humanity proved as important as formal treaties and political agreements. The women who experienced American kindness as prisoners became ambassadors for a different kind of relationship between former enemies. They raised children who grew up without hatred, who understood that people on the other side of any conflict are fundamentally human, capable of both terrible things and extraordinary grace. Today, the estate where the camp once stood has returned to private ownership. The tents are long gone, the barbed wire removed, but the river remains, flowing as it always has through the grounds. Local historians have placed a small marker near the bank, commemorating what happened there in the summer of 1945. It reads simply, "In this place, former enemies discovered their shared humanity. May we never forget that even in war, kindness is possible, and that such kindness can transform the world."
School groups sometimes visit the site. Teachers tell the story of German women prisoners being allowed to swim, of conversations between captors and captives that challenged assumptions and built bridges. Young people, growing up in a united Europe where the idea of war between Germany and America seems almost unthinkable, try to imagine a time when such enmity existed, when a simple act like swimming in a river could be revolutionary. The story endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and choice. We are not bound by cycles of violence and retribution.
We can choose differently. We can extend grace to those who have been our enemies. We can recognize our shared humanity even across the deepest divides. These are not naive fantasies. They are hard-won lessons learned by women who experienced both the cruelty of war and the unexpected kindness that reminded them of what it meant to be human. When historians debate what enabled Germany's successful reintegration into the community of democratic nations, they point to many factors: the Marshall Plan, the Nuremberg trials, the economic miracle of the 1950s, the courage of German leaders who confronted their nation's past. But there is another factor, harder to quantify but no less real: the thousands of individual Germans who had experienced a different vision of what was possible, who had been shown by their former enemies that another way existed. Women like Margarete, who swam in a river one summer and emerged with a new understanding of the world, became the human foundation on which reconciliation was built. The disbelief that began with food and shelter, that deepened with the offer of swimming in a river, ultimately transformed into something more profound: a belief in the possibility of change, both personal and collective. The women who experienced this transformation carried it with them for the rest of their lives, a quiet but powerful force for good in a world that desperately needed to learn how to live with old enemies. And so the story of the river lives on, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that in our darkest moments we can still choose light, that even when we have every reason to hate, we can choose understanding, that the walls between enemies are never as insurmountable as they seem, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to recognize the humanity of the person on the other side and to offer them, unexpectedly and without conditions, a moment of grace. The river still flows, and the lesson it taught remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. We are all, ultimately, just people trying to find our way home. And when we remember that, when we treat each other accordingly, we create the possibility of a better world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.